The salt spray hits the back of a boy's throat before he even opens his eyes, and somewhere above him, the wet crack of an oak hull against a grey sea tells him the longship has turned. He is maybe 12. He is standing in the shadow of a carved dragon prow, and he is about to see a coastline that no one in his village has ever described. This is the moment the textbooks skip. This is the moment the sagas soften. Because the boy is not going to raid, he is going to trade. And that single distinction, buried under 1,000 years of horned helmets and battle cries, is the crack in the myth that this entire story will pry open. If you have ever sat in a history class and been taught that the Viking Age was simply an era of bearded men burning monasteries and dying gloriously with axes in their hands, you have been handed a cartoon. The real thing is stranger, colder, and far more calculating. You are about to find out why a society that never built a single city of stone still managed to stitch together a network of rivers, silver, and fear that stretched from the icy North Atlantic all the way to the markets of the East. This is not a story about violence for its own sake. It is a story about what happens when a people realize the world is bigger than their fjords, and they decide to take it apart and rebuild it in their own image. Now, hold on. Before we go any further, you need to understand what you are actually looking at. The thing you think of as a Viking, the horned helmet, the unhinged berserker, the mindless pillager, that image was invented more than 1,000 years after the real thing. It was dressed up for an opera stage in the 19th century and never really took its costume off. The evidence we actually have shows a people obsessed with law, with sharp legal argument, with the proper way to settle a dispute. And that contradiction is the very heart of the mystery we are going to spend this whole journey unraveling. How did the most feared raiders of the medieval world also build one of its most sophisticated systems of justice? Because here is the promise, and I am making it to you right now, straight. By the time we reach the end of this story, you will understand the Viking Age in a way that almost nobody outside a handful of scholars does. You will see the raid on Lindisfarne, the famous first blow that everyone remembers for what it really was, not the opening scene of a mindless rampage, but a single tremor in a much larger system that was already in motion. And you will see the true invention of the Norse people, the thing they built that outlasted every king and every sword. It was not a weapon, it was a jury, and it changed everything. The official story goes like this. A summer day in the year 793, on a small island off the coast of Northumbria, a community of monks is living a quiet life of prayer and hard labor. They have no walls, no army, barely any weapons. They know the sea, but they fear nothing from it. Then, out of the morning haze, come the ships, low, fast, and utterly silent. The monks have never seen anything like them. The men who pour out of those hulls are not soldiers in any sense the monks understand. They have no banners, no heraldry, no code of honor. They are simply efficient. And by the time the sun is high, the monastery is ash, and the silence that settles over Lindisfarne is the silence of a grave. That is the moment Europe learns a new word. But here is the problem with that theory, and it is a problem you have probably never heard. The raiders at Lindisfarne were not a civilization deciding to become pirates. They were a society at a crossroads, squeezed by a changing world, and the monastery was not their destination. It was a symptom. To understand why those longships came out of the mist, you have to understand what was happening back home in Scandinavia. And back home, the most important thing was not the sword. It was the assembly. The thing, they called it. The very same word that survives today in your own word for a meeting of lawmakers. For the parliament in a far northern land that still bears that ancient name. Before they were raiders, they were jurors. Before they were raiders, they were jurors. The thing, an assembly that held Norse society together for centuries before a single longship ever slipped out of the morning haze. If you've ever sat through a history class, wondering why they only teach you about the swords, and never about the law that made these people tick. You're finally getting the real story, and it only gets stranger from here. So subscribe to keep following the evidence. And in the comments, tell me what your textbooks told you about the Vikings, because I'm willing to bet it wasn't the assembly. Now, this is where things get interesting, because the more you look at the evidence, the more the cartoon Viking falls apart in your hands. We have legal codes from the Norse world that are staggering in their detail, laws that spell out exactly how many witnesses you need to prove a claim, exactly how much compensation a family could demand for a killed or injured kinsman. We have runic inscriptions, small stone messages carved in the ancient alphabet that read less like battle cries and more like property disputes. One stone does not boast of a glorious death in battle. It simply says, a man was buried where he had settled a quarrel. The sagas, written down later but rooted in older tradition, are filled with long, tense scenes of people arguing legal fine points around a fire. And that is the first real crack in the official story. The same people who could burn a monastery to the ground could also sit for days debating the precise wording of a settlement agreement. The same hands that gripped an axe could swear an oath that they would die to uphold. You are looking at a society that was, in its own way, deeply lawful, and that lawfulness was not a contradiction of their violence. It was the fuel for it. They did not raid because they had no rules. They raided because they had rules, and the world beyond their shores did not. And that difference was about to rewrite the map of Europe. Let me take you somewhere for a moment. Picture a flat, treeless plain in Iceland, in the middle of summer, with the sun barely dipping below the horizon for a few hours of grey twilight. The ground is hard and cold. The wind never stops. And yet every summer, thousands of people travel for weeks to gather at a single spot, pitching tents, setting up booths, turning a bare landscape into a temporary town of wool and timber. This is the Great Assembly, the national gathering of the Icelandic Commonwealth. No king rules here, no general gives orders. The men who come are free farmers, each one the master of his own small world. And they are here to argue. What you are watching, if you could stand on that plain and look at it honestly, is the most radical political experiment in the medieval world. There is no standing army, no royal court, no executioner paid by a central power. When two families fall into a blood feud, the assembly does not send soldiers to crush them. Instead, the parties argue their case before a jury, and the law speaker, the one person who memorized the entire legal code and recites it aloud for everyone, holds the whole system together with nothing but memory and reputation. And here is the twist that should make you sit up straighter. This system worked. It held a violent, scattered people together for centuries without a king, and it was built on one single, fragile thing: trust. You see, there is a catch hidden inside that trust, and it is the catch that explains the entire Viking Age. When you build a society on oaths instead of armies, the oath is everything. A man who breaks his word in that world is not just embarrassing himself. He is unmaking the social fabric, tearing a hole in the safety net that keeps his neighbors alive through the long winter. So the pressure to keep an oath is enormous, and the punishment for breaking one is not a fine. It is exclusion, a kind of living death where no one will trade with you, marry into your family, or share a roof with you. Now take that same man and put him in a world where no one else shares his law, and the calculus changes completely. But it gets worse, because the same system that bought peace at home by making oaths sacred also turned the wider world into an open hunting ground. Think about it. A man from a Norse community could not break his word to his neighbor without destroying himself. But the monk in the monastery on the other side of the sea, the merchant in the foreign port, the farmer in the coastal village, they were outside the assembly. They were not part of the trust network. And if a man was bound by honor to keep faith with his own kind, he felt no such binding towards strangers. The very lawfulness that held Norse society together is what licensed its cruelty abroad. The raid was not an act of savagery. It was an act of logic. So the very trust that held the Longhouse together turned every stranger into prey. The lawfulness itself was the weapon. If you want to keep uncovering the real mechanics behind history's worst violence, subscribe, because we are barely past the first raid, and the next chapters get much darker. And drop your answer in the comments. What is the one unwritten rule of your own community? The code that gets outsiders shredded the second they break it. Let me bring this back to you, because this is where it stops being a museum exhibit and starts being something you can feel in your own chest. Have you ever joined a community, an online group, a guild in a game, where everyone follows the unwritten rules, and then watched an outsider come in and get shredded simply because they did not know the code? There is a part of your brain that relaxes when you are among your own, and a part that switches off its empathy when you are not. The Norse did not invent that instinct. They just built an entire civilization on top of it. And when that civilization ran out of room at home, they pointed that cold, lawful, ruthless instinct at the rest of the world. What you call the Viking Age is what happens when a jury system grows a fleet. Now, watch what happens next, because this is where the scale of the thing begins to double, then triple, then become almost impossible to hold in your mind at once. The raid on Lindisfarne was not a one-off. It was the first note of a song that Europe would hear for the next 3 centuries. Within a generation, the longships are not just appearing at isolated monasteries. They are coming up rivers, past cities, past fortifications that were never designed to face a threat from the water. And here is the detail that should make you slow down and pay attention. The Vikings were not just masters of the open sea. They were masters of the river. Their ships could sail in a few feet of water, could be dragged overland between rivers, could appear in the heart of a continent where no one had ever imagined an enemy could reach. So, you have to understand the geography the way they understood it, because their whole advantage was reading terrain differently than anyone else. The rivers of Europe were not barriers to them. They were highways: the Rhine, the Seine, the Loire. These were not natural defenses for the people who lived along them. They were invasion routes, deep cuts into the soft underbelly of the continent. And the Norse did not rush. They did not panic. They moved like water, finding the path of least resistance, settling at the mouths of rivers, building fortified camps, and then using those camps as bases to strike deeper and deeper inland. The monastery was easy. The river was the real prize. Which brings us to a moment that almost no one talks about, a moment that turns the whole cartoon on its head. You expect the next chapter of the Viking story to be more burning, more raids, more screaming towers. But the actual next chapter is much stranger. Because the Norse did not just attack the great cities of Europe, they moved into them. They set up shop as merchants, as mercenaries, as bodyguards for the very kings whose lands they had been plundering a generation earlier. The same man who could have swung an axe at your grandfather could now be standing behind your king, sworn to defend him. And the kings of Europe, desperate for warriors they could trust, made a deal with the devil. They hired the raiders, they gave them land, titles, and a place at the table. And the raiders, true to their own law, kept their oaths. This is the hidden machinery of the Viking Age, and it is far more disturbing than simple violence. Because it means the difference between a raider and a defender was not a matter of good and evil. It was a matter of who hired him first. The Norseman did not change his nature when he put on a new lord's badge. He did not become civilized. He just redirected his loyalty, and with it, his capacity for violence, toward a new master. And the kings who hired these men were not taming a threat. They were pointing a loaded weapon at their neighbors and hoping it would not go off in their hands. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But the pattern was set, and it would echo for 1,000 years. Let me slow down for just a moment, because I want you to feel the weight of what actually happened on that flat, wind-scoured plain in Iceland. Because it changes how you understand everything else. When the Norse reached Iceland, they did not build a kingdom. They built a parliament. They created a legal system so respected that even the most powerful chieftains submitted to its rulings, at least in public. And the reason they could do this, the reason it worked, is that every free man in that society had one thing that mattered more than his sword: his reputation. His standing in the assembly was his passport, his bank account, his shield, and his sword wrapped into one. Lose that, and you lost everything. So men argued, they negotiated, they brought lawsuits with the same intensity that other cultures brought armies into the field. It was war, but it was war fought with words. And yet, and here is the twist that should keep you up at night, that same society, so proud of its law, so invested in the power of words, produced the most feared warriors of the age. The two are not competing impulses. They are two faces of the same coin. The discipline that made a man sit and listen to a complex legal argument for 3 days is the same discipline that let him stand in a shield wall and not flinch when the enemy charged. The memory that let the law speaker recite the entire code from memory is the same memory that let a navigator cross the open ocean without a compass, guided by the stars and the feel of the sea. The Norse were not torn between civilization and savagery. They were simply applying the same extraordinary focus to both. I know what you are thinking, because I have seen this story told 100 times, and there is always a moment where the audience expects the narrator to fall back on the comfortable lie. You want me to tell you that the Vikings were really just misunderstood merchants, that the violence was an aberration, that deep down they were peaceful farmers who only fought when they had to. I am not going to tell you that, because it is not true, and because it is a disservice to the real story. The violence was real. The enslavement was real. The terror that a longship brought to a coastal village was real, and it was not an accident. It was a tool. But the law was equally real. The trade was equally real. The oaths were equally real. And the tragedy of the Viking Age is that these two realities cannot be separated. This is the point where the story stops being about history and becomes about you. And I need you to stay with me, because this is the uncomfortable part. The world the Norse built was one where your place was fixed. You were born into a family, a farm, a set of obligations. You could not simply decide to become someone else. Your worth was determined by your kin, by the oaths they could swear for you, by the compensation your death would bring them. There was no career change, no moving to the city to reinvent yourself. You were who you were born to be, and the law existed to keep you there. Now think about your own life, how much freedom you have, how many choices are open to you that would have been unthinkable to a Norse farmer's son. That freedom was purchased at a terrible cost by people who had none. That freedom you are sitting in right now, the choice to reinvent yourself tomorrow, to leave your name, your town, your entire identity behind, was paid for by people who never got to make a single choice. If you want to see what happens when a world built on those shackles finally starts to break, you cannot leave now, because the collapse is worse than the raid ever was. Subscribe, so you are here when the oaths fail and the system eats itself. This is the buried part they never put in the textbooks. And drop one word in the comments: fixed. Tell me if you believe a life where your place was certain forever would be worth giving up the freedom you have right now. But here is the thing nobody tells you, and it is the thing that turns the whole story around one final time. The Viking Age did not end because the raiders were defeated in battle. It ended because the system that made them successful stopped working. The oaths began to fail. The trust that held the assembly together corroded slowly over generations as power concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer chieftains. By the time the last great king of Norway stood on the field at Stamford Bridge in the year 1066, ready to claim a kingdom in England, the world had changed around him. The old ways, the assembly, the free farmer, the oath-sworn bond, they were already becoming memory. And when that king fell, something larger than a man fell with him. Watch what happens at Stamford Bridge, because it is one of those moments where history writes a perfect ending without meaning to. The Norwegian king, riding to victory, expecting to take the English crown, is caught by surprise. The English army, marching with impossible speed, catches him unprepared. And the battle that follows is not a glorious clash of equal forces. It is a slaughter. The Norse king is killed, his army broken, his dream of a northern empire dead in a single afternoon. And the chroniclers tell us that the fleet that sailed home afterwards was so small, so diminished, that it could have fit in a handful of ships. The Viking Age did not go out with a dramatic final charge. It went out exhausted, broke, and a little sad. Now, let me close the loops we opened, because you have earned the payoff. Remember the boy in the prow of the longship, the one who was going to trade instead of raid? He is the real story, because the Norse did not vanish after Stamford Bridge. They became something else. They became the merchants of the northern seas, the settlers of Iceland, the founders of cities you have heard of, the ancestors of people who still gather in assemblies that bear their ancient word for judgment. The violence was real, but it was not the whole story. It was never the whole story. And the law, the assembly, the oaths, those were not a mask for savagery. They were the engine that made everything else possible, for better and for worse. The old myth says the Vikings were mindless savages. The new myth says they were peaceful traders. The truth, the real truth that you now carry, is stranger than either. They were a people who built one of the most impressive legal systems of the medieval world, and then turned that same fierce commitment to their values loose on a world that did not share them. They were lawgivers and raiders in the same breath, and they did not see the contradiction. That is what makes them so hard to look at, and so impossible to forget. You came in expecting horned helmets, and left seeing something far more uncomfortable. You left seeing yourself, and the thin line between the rules you follow and the ones you do not. And while that settlement crystallized in the cold north, a different storm was already gathering on the great plains of the east, where riders on fast horses were teaching themselves the same lesson about trust and its limits, about oaths and the cost of breaking them. But that is a story for another day. For now, remember the boy, the 1,000-year-old boy, standing in the shadow of a dragon prow, about to meet a world he was not born into and remake it in his own image. And when you hold your own freedom in your hands, the freedom he could never have dreamed of, ask yourself what oaths you would die to keep. Because that is the real inheritance of the Viking Age. Not the violence, not the silver. The question,